September 30th, 1955, on a deserted road north of Bakersfield, California, 24-year-old James Dean races towards immortality. With a Hollywood career of only 3 films in just 15 months, his tragic early death was probably the best career move he ever made.
Three movies, man, 24 years old. Where were you at 24, you know? My name is Martin Sheen, and when I think about actors that had an influence on my life, I have to begin and almost end with James Dean.
Indiana-born James Dean spent the last evening of his life in Los Angeles. In 24 hours, he would be dead, with barely a hint of the legacy he was to leave behind.
Ah, you're touchy, Vic. You're touchy as an old cook.
His acting was from inside and very human and very honest. And I think that has a lot to do with his fame.
So many people who, seeing him on the screen, felt they'd known him all their lives, because he had that extra intense warmth and hunger.
In the hours leading up to his death, Jimmy, a lifelong insomniac, was spotted cruising the nighttime streets of Los Angeles. Like the characters he portrayed on screen, he had a turbulent private life. To those that knew him well, he was a seething mass of contradictions.
The James Dean I knew was a lot of different people. There was a consistency only in his inconsistency.
Some claim he was a psychopath with a death wish, while others talk of his manic lust for life.
People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway.
To those who worked with him, he was pig-headed, arrogant, and yet open to suggestion.
I'm involved. We are all involved. Mom, a boy, a kid was killed tonight.
Some friends describe him as generous, others as mean-spirited, wise for his years, or boyishly adolescent, moody, and a dedicated party animal with reputed S&M tendencies, nicknamed the human ashtray. Certainly his macho image concealed a more vulnerable, feminine side.
You say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again.
Intense he was, deeply intense, frighteningly intense at times. I mean, he could scare the hell out of you.
Too many people have said Jimmy was difficult. I found him difficult but manageable.
But there's no doubt he was a complex and gifted actor whose tormented teenage screen persona caught the imagination of an entire generation and still rings true today, over 40 years after his death.
He revealed something so deeply personal. It was a wallop when it got to the screen, man. Nobody had that power. And he was there and gone. By the time we realized what hit us, he was gone, man. It was over. He was out of there.
You're tearing me apart!
On that last evening, it's certain that James Dean would have been preoccupied with the thought that he'd soon be let loose behind the wheel of his brand new racing Porsche. He was notorious for his addiction to speed and danger. The prospect of cheating death was a driving force. With 5 races and 3 victories under his belt, he was a talented driver, respected within the racing community. While he'd been filming Giant, he'd been forbidden by Warner Brothers to indulge in his passion. So immediately the film wrapped, he'd entered a race in Salinas, some 350 miles north of Los Angeles. He was to travel there in the morning. There are conflicting reports as to how James Dean spent that final evening. Some have placed him at a gay beach party in Malibu, 20 miles up the coast, where he is alleged to have had a fight with a former lover. Another 5 different people claim to have had dinner with him. None of these stories appear to be true.
My name is Bill Bast. I'm a writer. Jimmy Dean was my best friend. Friday evening, I had been talking to him about this new sport I had seen called kendo. It was visually very interesting and choreographed beautifully, and he was anxious to see that. Sandy Roth, who had been the still photographer on Giant, took a definitive last photograph that night of Jimmy, and it's a picture of Jimmy sitting watching the kendo match from the stands, peering over his glasses, and he was a very old James Dean. And what few people realize is that when he was shooting the end of Giant, he was playing a 58-year-old man in the picture. So in order to affect the look of an older man, they had shaved back his hairline, and he looked old. He looks old in the photograph. And that's how he went to his death the next day, looking like an old man.
James Dean left the kendo tournament around 11 p.m. It's not clear if he went straight home to bed that night or stopped off at a party along the way. Though Jimmy had no shortage of sexual partners of either sex, it's clear that he spent his final night alone.
I don't think he really understood sex at all. I'm Leonard Rosenman. I was a friend of Jimmy Dean, and I wrote the music for his 2 first films, East of Eden and Rebel Without a Cause. Every girlfriend he had, he wouldn't really even go out with her unless he brought her to my house with my first wife and so on, and at a dinner. He would ask the next day, well, what do you think? Oh, she's nice, she's terrific. Then he'd go out with her.
My name is Tasha Martell. At the time that I first met Jimmy Dean, my name was Arlene Greta Sachs. I was 15, I was a teenager, and he was an older man. I entered into the relationship as a very innocent girl. I really was a virgin, and he obviously was not. And I was dazed, and of course he was very amazed because I was, in fact, a woman of my word. I was a virgin, and he was very surprised because I believe he had women throwing themselves at him who had a much experience.
Many men also found Jimmy sexually attractive, and he was not above using sex to get his own way. He told Hollywood gossip columnist Hedda Hopper that he avoided being drafted to Korea by telling the army he was homosexual.
I think Jimmy had just a little overly healthy spewing of female characteristics. That alone doesn't make a person a homosexual, you know. I'm Mila Nurmi. In 1954, when I met Jimmy, I was known as Vampira. I was a local television horror host. Jimmy and I were playmates. We had similar senses of humor. We spent a lot of time together from midnight to 5 a.m. most nights. And I was also a West Coast mother figure to him. Jimmy had a lot of rejection from women in the little while that I knew him. First, Pier Angeli turned her back and married the other, and then Ursula dumped him. And then in New York, there had been a girl, which I didn't know about, who had apparently dumped him at that time.
He was an experimenter. In the name of acting alone, he was able to hide behind the excuse that an actor needs, as Stanislavski put it, to experience everything. So that he may have or did dabble in almost everything is a probability rather than a possibility.
Somebody asked him if he was a homosexual, and it is true. He did say, do I look like somebody who would go through life with his hands tied behind his back? So he admitted that he had experimented with the bisexuality.
What his actual bents were, I don't like to speculate on. I can only speak from a personal point of view. And I do know that he did have extensive experiences on both sides of the fence.
I don't think he was a homosexual. I really don't. I think he was extremely confused. My name is Dizzy Sheridan. I was Jimmy Dean's girlfriend and lover and friend. I don't think he thought very much about the difference between bedding down with a male or a female. I don't think sex was all that important to him, as it was not a drive, you know? He was not sex-driven, as some people would like to think.
Alone in his one-roomed rented apartment in Sherman Oaks, a quiet suburb of Los Angeles, he was woken early by his landlord, who had been instructed to make sure Jimmy wouldn't be late for the race. By 8:30, he was on his way downtown to collect his racing car from the garage. It was almost 10:30 when photographers Sanford Roth and racing driver Bill Hickman met up with Jimmy at the Porsche garage of Competition Motors. Here, they found German mechanic Rolf Wertherich making final adjustments to the car. Jimmy's car, a 1955 Porsche Spyder 550, was only a week old. The 1500cc engine needed intricate tuning if it was to reach its full racing speed.
Jimmy phoned me first and asked me if I would like to go, and I said I had some work to do. He tried to persuade me, and then he said, well, if you really change your mind, come down to the garage and we'll go. You can drive with Sandy. Sandy Roth was going in a station wagon that followed the car, and he would be driving in the Porsche with his mechanic.
My name is George Barris from Barris Custom Industries in North Hollywood, California, USA, and I customized the Porsche Spyder that James Dean was killed in, and we painted on the back Little Bastard. And he wanted Little Bastard on the back of it because he was considered a person that was not with the establishment, and he wanted it to be known and on his car, so when drivers come up behind him, they all knew he was a little bastard.
James Dean, Hollywood's newest rebel, was ready to race, and to hell with the consequences.
James Dean didn't have in his vocabulary what flirt with danger was. When the word danger came up, he was standing full on, facing it, shoulders square and looking it straight in the eye. I'm Monty Roberts, and James Dean was killed coming to my house in Salinas, California.
He said, well, I want to conquer death. And I said, well, you can't conquer death. Nobody can conquer death. And I said, well, I have a feeling that unconsciously you want to die.
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine.
By midday, mechanic Rolf Wertherich had finished tuning James Dean's new racing Porsche Spyder 550. Jimmy had less than 6 hours to live.
The last time that I saw Jimmy, we sat in a cab and we hugged and we held hands.
It was about a week before he died. It was at the Villa Capri. I remember he was telling me he was going to go to a race soon, and he would call me, and then I didn't hear from him. Of course.
We hugged and we kissed, and I walked down, and he was there, and it, like Humphrey Bogart and what's her name, with the mist and the whole thing and the airplanes, and Rick and Elsa or whatever they were, whoever they were. It was very dramatic and really kind of wonderful.
He's not going to live very long, It was just a certainty that I should probably die before I'm 25. And he said it with such serenity. There wasn't any fear, there wasn't any alarm. It was almost like saying, I'm saying goodbye to you now because I won't be able to say goodbye to you.
Before he left on his final journey, James Dean had one last thing to take care of. In a nearby diner, he met his father, Winton. They lunched over coffee and donuts. Jimmy was desperate for him to come and see the race, but his father refused. He had rejected his son for the final time.
Your son, Aaron, he's everything that's good. Say hello to your mother, Aaron. Say hello to your mother!
Jimmy had had a troubled relationship with his father ever since he abandoned him, aged only 9, shortly after his mother died tragically of cancer.
The father sent the mother in a coffin from California into the Midwest, where she was buried, and he also sent Jimmy with her. And so he lost his mother and his father. Horror, the horror. Can you imagine leaving a 9-year-old boy alone with the love of his life and nobody there with him in terms of parents? It was a cruel kind of thing that really almost was a way of trying to murder him.
So, rejected by his father, Jimmy was raised by his aunt and uncle in Fairmount, Indiana. The loss of his mother had a crushing effect on Jimmy.
I remember him asking me once if she were in her casket and if it snowed on the ground, would she feel the snow or would she hear it? And then he quickly changed the subject, and she left him when he probably needed her. You know, it happens so often. And his father didn't want to bring him up. They just didn't connect.
Back at the garage, Jimmy and his mechanic made last-minute checks. As a racing safety precaution, they fitted a seatbelt to the driver's side, although the coroner noted Dean was not wearing a seatbelt when he crashed. The plan was to load the car onto a trailer and tow it north to Salinas. At some point in the final preparations, someone changed the plan and decided to drive the Porsche to the race. Maybe it was Jimmy, anxious to get behind the wheel. Whoever it was, it proved to be a fatal decision.
We had the car loaded. We filled up the tank on the little wagon that was towing him. And the mechanic was with him, and Rolf, and up and said, I want to drive the car up there. And I says, come on, Jimmy, that's 350 miles. You don't want to drive up there. You want to save the car for the race. No, I want to take it off. So we took the car off. And he said, who is going to go with me? And of course, Rolf put up his hand. I'll go with you. Let's go. I'm a believer that you're destined. When something comes around at a certain period of time, whether it's cancer or whether it's an accident, in this day he could have been just destined because the car was on the trailer, they were on the road ready to go, and it came off at the last second.
At 2 o'clock on that Friday afternoon, James Dean started off on what would become his final drive. Heading north out of Los Angeles, he chose what he thought would be a safer route for his precious Porsche. He'd become familiar with the highways around LA since moving there from his home in Fairmount. Jimmy had grown up an Indiana farm boy, cared for by his Aunt Hortense and Uncle Marcus, a boy with a passion for motorbikes and acting. It was in June 1949 that 18-year-old Jimmy left home to live with his dental technician father in Los Angeles. Here, he enrolled in the drama department at UCLA.
I met James Dean at UCLA. We were both in the theater arts department. He was a new student and didn't know anyone on campus. He was appearing in Macbeth, and I was working on the production crew of Macbeth, and he was cast as Malcolm, and he was terrible. He couldn't have been worse, and I found myself in the position of sitting in the dark house during the rehearsals, whispering to my co-workers, who's the Indiana hick with the terrible accent?
By 2:30, Jimmy cleared the worst of the LA traffic. Passenger Rolf Wertherick was kept busy lighting endless cigarettes as Jimmy chain-smoked his way into Kern County, happy to leave the pressures of his career far behind. In 1951, Jimmy moved to New York to try his hand on Broadway. There he attended Lee Strasberg's famous Actors Studio, home of method acting. Soon he was being cast in bigger and better stage roles, due partly to his relationship with theatre director Rogers Brackett, a father figure who had a profound influence on his life. It wasn't until Brackett's death and the publication of his memoirs that details of their homosexual affair went public.
I think Rogers Brackett was a kind of a mentor and took Jimmy under his wing, and it was kind of heady for him, you know. Then he became, I think, more demanding of his time and of his person, and it made Jimmy very uncomfortable and very unhappy.
I didn't know in which way he knew him. I didn't know that until after he died, because I didn't investigate.
When he, using his word, succumbed to him on the train going to Chicago, it bothered him so much that he left Chicago without Rogers and flew to New York.
Jimmy was a victim of the infamous casting couch, selling his body to get work, giving head to get ahead, as they say in Hollywood. But the sexual nature of the revelations in Rogers Brackett's memoirs left many of Jimmy's friends with their illusions shattered.
And it was really only years later that I was told that their relationship had been a sexual one. The part that hurt was feeling that he might have gone along with these relationships for the material and benefits that they would provide. That was crushing. If you're using your sexuality in order to advance your career, that somehow has a very tainted and tawdry aspect that I didn't want to think of him as that.
As Jimmy and Rolf Wertherick sped down the Grapevine, an open and fast stretch of road through the Sierra Madre Hills, Jimmy pushed the car to its limits. Photographer Sanford Roth and racing driver Bill Hickman, following them to the race in a Ford station wagon, struggled to keep up. Both cars were well over the speed limit.
I was working South 99 out of Bakersfield, and I noticed a small sport car coming down the hill at the foot of the Grapevine. Now, my name is Odie Hunter. I was with the Highway Patrol for 31 years, and I gave James Dean a citation for speeding a couple of hours or so before he was killed in 1955. About 100 yards or so behind him was a pickup truck towing a trailer, and he was also speeding, seemed to be running together. So I made a U-turn on the highway, it was a freeway, and caught the two of them near Mettler Station, which is 20 miles south of Bakersfield.
Good afternoon.
After success on Broadway, Jimmy started to get regular acting work in New York, first in a series of TV roles. Then came his big break, when he was spotted by Elia Kazan and cast in Hollywood's version of John Steinbeck's East of Eden.
How come you did it?
Did what?
Shot my father.
Because he tried to hold me. He tried to tie me down.
East of Eden was quickly followed by Rebel Without a Cause, the movie that made Jimmy's name as America's first delinquent teenager. The film's themes of juvenile rebellion and a tragic driving accident had an eerie parallel with Dean's own early death. In Hollywood circles, there was a buzz about Jimmy, but to the outside world, he was just another driver going too fast.
Do you have a driver's license I can get a look at, please?
I looked at a driver's license, and it had his name and address on it, which wasn't familiar because that was before his movie career had hit the sky the way it did. But I asked him where he worked. He said Warner Brothers or some movie studio. I forgot who it was.
You some sort of an actor?
I advised him of what he was doing, that he was speeding, and he didn't have any argument about it. He knew that he was. And then he started talking about the car, that they had just got the car in from Germany. Apparently it was working pretty well because it was running real well.
How fast will this car go?
Oh, clocked about 102 to 107 miles per hour.
It's doing over 65. I think around 70. I believe I wrote the ticket for 65.
Okay, Mr. Dean, I'm going to have to give you a citation. If you bear with me, I'll be on the road in just a few minutes. Friday, September 30th, 3:30.
As they drove away, Jimmy probably laughed at the irony of what had just happened. Only 10 days earlier, he'd made a public safety film warning the youth of America about the perils of fast driving.
Jimmy, we probably have a great many young people watching our show tonight, and for their benefit, I'd like your opinion about fast driving on the highway. Do you think it's a good idea?
It's a good point. I used to fly around quite a bit, you know. I took a lot of unnecessary chances on the highways. And I started racing, and so now I drive on the highways and I'm extra cautious. Because no one knows what they're doing. Half the time you don't know what this guy's going to do with that one. On a track, there are a lot of men who spend a lot of time developing rules and ways of safety. And I find myself being very cautious on the highway.
Jimmy continued to ignore the speed limit. As he drove west on Highway 466, the Porsche soon left the station wagon far behind. It was shortly before 5 when they pulled into a roadside diner. Jimmy had spotted some race cars in the parking lot and was eager to speak to the drivers. As Jimmy sipped his final soda, he bragged to his fellow racers that he'd managed to get his Porsche up to 130 miles per hour. He was in a light-hearted mood as he joked that the tabloids would have a field day if they ever found out about his speeding ticket.
He had a great sense of humor. You know, it depends upon what your sense of humor is, whether you appreciated his humor or not, but he, you know, he loved a good laugh and was a prankster as well.
He would remove his bridge and he was toothless. And it was the most shocking thing because here was this wonderful face and handsome, and then he would take out the teeth
and putting them in people's drinks when they weren't looking. And they'd look in their drink and they'd pick it up, and my God, and people would scream, and the louder you screamed, the more he'd laugh. He loved to do that.
I set up this mock orgy that would look like we were having this orgy, but really wasn't at all. He came over, and it looked like this one was in this corner, 2 people were in a bed, nothing was happening, and he stood in the middle of the floor, unzipped himself, and proceeded to masturbate.
Lizzie broke into hysterical laughter and thought it was one of the funniest things she's ever seen, and he stomped out. I think more in embarrassment that she had laughed than in, you know, anything else.
I said, Jimmy, I met a lady today who knows you. She said that you were naked on the set at Warner Brothers. She said I was. I said, why? You were? He said, yeah. I was in my dressing room changing clothes. I didn't have anything on, and all of a sudden this guy walked in. He said it was my wardrobe man. But I said, ew, and I screamed, and I ran out, and I said, there's a man in my dressing room. And nobody laughed.
He was emulating Marlon Brando, and Brando at the time was the great naughty boy of theater and film. And Dean was determined to out-Brando Brando. And Ella Logan gave a party one time where he whipped out his cock and peed into a glass of, I guess it was scotch or something, in front of everybody. And no one thought it was funny. No one thought it was funny.
It was 5:30 when Jimmy left the diner and drove off into what was to be his final drive into immortality. The sun was getting low in the sky as the silver-grey Porsche continued west on Highway 466. There was little traffic on the roads that afternoon, but those witnesses that saw the Porsche all agree it was traveling fast. One person who claimed he did not see the Porsche was crucial to the events of the next few seconds. Donald Turnipseed, a 23-year-old student. At 5:45 p.m., he reached the junction that joins highways 41 to 466. As he pulled into the center of the road to make a left turn, he paused momentarily, then continued straight across the oncoming lane. Jimmy saw the car pause, then move across directly in front of him. As Turnipseed pulled forward, Jimmy said his final words to Rolf Wertherich, "That guy's got to see us. He's got to stop." A split second later, Jimmy realized Turnipseed wasn't going to stop. Another split second, and Jimmy was frantically attempting to swerve around the car that was now on a collision course. James Dean's Porsche crashed into Donald Turnipseed's Ford at 5:45 p.m. on September 30th, 1955. The 24-year-old actor was killed instantly, his neck broken and his body ripped apart by the impact, which catapulted the car along the highway. Miraculously, Rolf Wertherich survived with over 20 broken bones as he was thrown into the roadside. Donald Turnipseed suffered only minor bruising.
My name is Joy Gorelli. I was working as a police clerk at the Paso Robles Police Department at the time of the James Dean accident. This call was just a call that there was a bad accident out at the Y.
My name is Ernie Tripke. I was a member of the California Highway Patrol working out of the Paso Robles office the night in which James Dean was killed in an auto accident. Ron and I had just reported for duty at the Paso Robles Police Department, which we worked out of at the time. And it was just before 6 o'clock in the evening.
My name is Ronald Nelson, and I was a California Highway Patrol at the time of the accident.
When we received the call of the accident, Ron and I were in separate vehicles, and we proceeded to the scene of the accident, which was at the intersection of Highway 41 and 46. When we arrived at the scene of the accident, we found a 51 Ford coupe in the roadway.
And the Porsche was probably northwest, over next to the fence. The damage to Turnipseed's car was extensively in the left front. Now the damage to the Porsche was the entire left side.
When we arrived at the scene, I had no idea who any of the participants in the accident were. I found out it was James Dean, whom I had never heard of at the time. During the course of the investigation, several vehicles stopped and asked, is that Dean's car or is that James Dean's car?
The only James Dean, or Jimmy Dean, I knew was the singer and the sausage maker.
Life in its every emotion leaps from the pages of John Steinbeck's best of all his bestsellers.
At the time of his death, only the first of Dean's films, East of Eden, had been released.
Of people who loved so deeply, hate so fiercely, lived so recklessly. Warner Brothers had to seek out vibrant new personalities, tap new sources of talent, create new stars. James Dean as Cal, the wildest boy you've ever met.
When we arrived, they were just loading the victims into the ambulance. That is the James Dean and his passenger. The other driver did not go to the hospital.
I think he went in first, and then the His mechanic went in later. But I was more interested in handling the traffic and taking pictures.
Sometime later, the ambulance came back, and they were not under siren at all, and I knew that it was a fatal accident then, and they went right by the police department. They weren't going very fast, and I noticed a hand hanging out from underneath the covering on the stretcher, and it was blood on it. And of course we didn't know it was James Dean, and found out about it later.
We took statements from Turnipseed, and he said he did not see Dean approaching as he made his left turn. It was just about sundown, and kind of a gray horizon, and the silver-colored Porsche with a very low profile made it very difficult to see. And we did visit the site several days afterwards, approximately the same time, and it was quite true, because the Porsche sort of blended in with the general landscape there. We interviewed some people, but no one was really in a position to tell us exactly what happened at the point of impact. They came upon the scene shortly afterwards, and we got statements from them, but there was no one there that was actually following Turnipseed or following Dean to give a real clear description of what happened.
As the wrecked Porsche was taken to a nearby garage, news of the death of James Dean started to filter through to the outside world.
I was working, I think, the 2 to 10 p.m. shift, and I got in around 9:30 or so, somewhere in that range, and was talking to one of the crew that was coming on at midnight for the graveyard, and one of the guys who was a friend of mine said, did you hear about James Dean getting killed? And I said, no, I didn't. Who's James Dean? He said, oh, he's a movie actor, just starting. And then it suddenly dawned on me, the name hit me then, and I reached in my pocket and pulled out the tickets, and sure enough, he was the one that I'd given the citation to.
James Dean was pronounced dead on arrival at Paso Robles Memorial Hospital, and his body was taken to a nearby funeral home. News of his death had now reached as far as Los Angeles.
I happened to be on a beach, was listening to music on the radio. It was a little radio on the bar, and they announced his death, that he was killed in a crash. And all I felt was an impact, just a strong impact, but nothing else. No pain, no feeling anything.
I've often wondered what it would have been like to have been there. I'm rather grateful that I wasn't. I don't know how I would have survived that.
Even though East of Eden was on general release, Jimmy was not yet a household name. So when his death made headlines all over America, the story read as the tragic waste of a young life, rather than the death of a major film star. Jimmy's funeral was held 8 days later, on October 8th, in a small Quaker church in his hometown of Fairmount. The church was packed with local townspeople. No film stars, no celebrities, and few of his friends.
I chose not to attend Jimmy's funeral in the first place because I couldn't afford to go back to Indiana. A Hollywood columnist was putting together a charter flight. I later found out, but I didn't know that at the time. I was torn. I knew the family, but I also knew what was going to go on. I knew it was going to become a circus. I just chickened out. I just couldn't face it. I just couldn't do it.
I stayed away because it would have caused great discomfort for the remaining, relatives. I knew that my being there would have caused an unpleasant stir. I don't want to do that, but I went there a month later, and I saw the first snowflake melting on his grave.
3,000 local people stood at Jimmy's graveside as he was laid to rest in Fairmount Cemetery. Elizabeth Taylor, co-star in his last film Giant, was too distraught to attend and sent flowers. In the 40 years since his death, Jimmy's grave has become a shrine for thousands of devoted fans. 3 days after his death, Warner Brothers released Rebel Without a Cause, which was followed by Giant, to the fanfare of a glittering, star-studded premiere. The films were instant hits. The legend of James Dean the movie star was born, just a few months after the real James Dean met his untimely death. For those critics that regarded Jimmy's career as a mere flash in the pan, Giant saw them grudgingly admit his talent.
This is Texas, mighty colossus of the Southwest, a land of infinite variety.
He stole the movie from Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor and received his second posthumous Oscar nomination.
I'm a rich boy. Me, I'm gonna have more money than you ever thought of having.
Why, that's wonderful, Jim.
In the period following his death, Warners were deluged with 8,000 fan letters for Jimmy each week. As the studio publicity machine kicked into top gear, it was careful to play down the imminent coroner's inquest in case it tarnished the image of their golden boy.
There were 2 persons injured and 1 killed. Number 1 injured was Donald Jean Turnipseed, driver of vehicle number 1. Number 2 injured was Rolf Witherick, a passenger in the Dean car. The dead was James Byron Dean, DOA, or dead on arrival at the hospital.
The inquest was requested by us because it was the matter of determining if the other driver was sufficiently involved in the accident to be declared at fault. And since Dean was deceased, he could not be prosecuted. Therefore, we had the coroner's inquest.
People seem to forget that that Porsche was very, very, very dangerous car to drive in at the time, the design of that car. And it was the slightest accident could have been catastrophic anyway.
We did do some background on the check on this, and we found out that Dean had received a citation on the grapevine over near